Welcome to our LinkedIn Live event. When should business reopen ethics, health, and getting America back to work? Sponsored by the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, the Jesuit University in Silicon Valley. Welcome to all our audience. Great to have you with us today for our LinkedIn Live event. When should businesses reopen? Ethics, health, and getting America back to work. Sponsored by the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, the Jesuit University in Silicon Valley. At the Ethics Center, we like to say that, like birds, ethical issues are everywhere. We simply need to talk with each other and be trained to see them. And certainly the issue we're dealing with today has ethical issues everywhere. Invite you to stay tuned in next week's for future live LinkedIn Live event from the Ethics Center on journalism and disinformation in the pandemic, and invite you to go to our website, www.scu.ethics.edu/ethics to find more material on the topic we're discussing today. We're delighted to see a great roster of people coming in to listen to our show. We've got a great lineup of people to talk with today. I think many of you have been following this around the country as conversations have come up, as demonstrations have come up, and as the federal government and state governments are grappling with a very difficult issue, really a situation that many have compared to a needed preparation, a mobilization for war, and going back to the Second World War and to the Great Depression to consider the kinds of unemployment and economic shock that we're all going through at the same time as we're dealing with a remarkable situation of public health and widespread concerns about mortality. The Ethics Center has many different program areas, and we invite you to take a look at our website to consider those. And in any case, look forward to having your questions as we go to the show today. So we've got a great lineup of speakers today, and let me introduce them right now. A special welcome to our guests from outside the center, Susan Brennan, the Chief Operating Officer of Bloom Energy, a green energy company in San Jose. Welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And Chuck Hammers, the CEO of Pizza My Heart, a beloved surf-themed series of restaurants in the Bay Area, a great favorite of Santa Clara students and many others. Chuck, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, David. And as you know, previously, I don't go by CEO, but I go by the Big Cheese.
The Big Cheese. Chuck the Big Cheese is with us. And then also my colleague, Ann Skeet, a longtime executive in Silicon Valley and the Senior Director of Leadership Ethics for the last year at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. Ann, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thanks.
So to get us started, after that very brief introduction, I'm wondering if each of you could talk a bit about your experiences in the last months in businesses in the case of Chuck and Susan, and in your work at the Ethics Center in responding to the pandemic. And in the course of it, Chuck and Susan, I wonder if you could introduce our audience to the nature of your business, the size, revenue, numbers of employees, things like that. So Chuck, if I could invite you to get us started, please.
Sure. So I've got 25.99 restaurants here in the Bay Area. And we've closed 2 of them. We closed the Valley Fair Mall, obviously, and we also closed the San Jose Airport one. And I say 0.99 because we were within days of opening a new one in Cupertino, and we can't get the final permits. So that one's kind of sitting in limbo. So 23 are operating. Our business got whacked, and we've got a lot less revenue right now. And we've laid off 162 people, which is really sad for me. But we're still operating, so that's good that we're still getting a lot of work to our employees.
Great, thank you so much. And Susan, if you could introduce us to Bloom Energy and how you all have fared during these very difficult months.
Yeah, thank you, David. So let me describe what Bloom Energy does first, and then I'll talk a little bit about our business. But we are headquartered in San Jose, and we are a clean, reliable, distributed power generator. So we produce what often called Bloom boxes that produce energy. And as such, since we provide electricity to hospitals, data centers, grocery stores, we have been deemed an essential workplace, both on the West Coast and the East Coast. Now, however, that means our factories are working, but the majority of our employees are still at home. And as part of what we do, we are the only company that has ever commercially produced the technology that we have. So we also make our own service parts. So we are producing both product for hospitals, data centers, and grocery stores, as well as producing parts for the field that we have, which is a global field, US, Korea, India, and Japan. So this has been a very challenging time for everyone. So we find ourselves in a situation where providing a safe workforce, which is always important, is even more important today. So that's the situation we find ourselves in today.
Thank you very much, Susan. And Anne, if you could tell us about your work and what you've been thinking about at the Ethics Center and in your writing on ethics in the pandemic and business in the last months.
Sure, happy to, David. As you know, I come to the work from a more practical, applied background as a business and nonprofit leader. And I guess in this moment, I just have tremendous compassion for people who find themselves in leadership positions in the middle of a global pandemic that has arrived at one of the most polarized times in our history. So I've been trying to write to encourage ethical leadership practices, and to really honor what I'm seeing from so many people in leadership positions, which is a prioritizing of the common good and a real commitment to it. And I've also been observing a bit about how the wisdom of followers is carrying us through. I think people are doing an excellent job of determining who are the most effective leaders to listen to.
Great. Well, thank you very much, all three of you, giving us a nice sense of your work and some of the initial great challenges you've been facing. Why don't we move into this question at kind of first a sort of more general level, the whole issue of whether to reopen, if that's even the right term, the economy, reopen businesses has been on the radar for really the last couple of months. The president had talked about this as initially wanting it to happen by Easter. Of course, that's passed. It's a debate going on around the country. It's been framed often as the sort of the cure can't be worse than a disease, or government versus freedom, or profits versus lives. Do you agree with those framings, or how do you frame the challenge, the dilemma we're facing right now as a country in looking at how to restart the economy in this time of the pandemic? And Chuck, if I could go to you again, please, to start us off there.
So yes, we would desperately love to be open fully and have the dining rooms open again. We are partially open. We're doing delivery and takeout, but like I said, we laid off 162 people. I would love to get them back to work. That's our number one job that we want to do. So, but I also look at this as it's not a binary decision. It's not a yes or no. There's something in between, because we also have to make sure that our people are safe. And I don't know that that happens by just saying, okay, the restaurants are open. So I think it's going to be something gradual, and that's what's going to work best in our case is maybe it's a restaurant's open and we can allow 15 or 20 people in the restaurant at the time. We don't know, but we're not saying this is one versus the other, open versus closed. I think it's going to be something of a slide back in.
Great, thank you. And Susan.
Yeah, to build on what Chuck is saying, I don't think anything in today's world is binary. So I've run manufacturing facilities for most of my career, over 30 years, and the safety component of running a manufacturing plant is the base of the pyramid. So whether it's working with stamping presses or forklifts and dealing with that level of safety, this is a new level of safety. And it's managing both assuring the employees are safe based on the data that keeps coming in, and the data changes and the rules change. So it's one, maintaining and being very, very flexible and making sure that you're tied in to the right sources, as Ann was talking about, to make sure that you're providing the physical safety for the employees. But there's another aspect of what I call psychological safety. And I'll just use an example of that. So since we have been deemed an essential provider, our employees were out on, this has been now the 7th week, if you remember back to St. Patrick's Day. So if you're one of 10 cars on 101, that can be a really intimidating place to be, combined with the information that's coming to our employees. And the number one thing our employees wanted was a letter that if they got pulled over by a police officer saying that they were an essential employee. So it's the things that you think about, but it's the things that you don't think about, really providing that very, very safe environment where the employees are safe from a physical standpoint, but also psychological, that you're listening to everything they have to say and immediately providing what they ask for, as long as it makes sense. And it almost always does.
Thank you. And Ann, and how are you thinking about how this issue is framed and ought to be framed?
Well, as you know, David, there's lots of different frameworks we use in thinking about ethics. For this moment, I like the ethics of care, because it really talks about balancing care for yourself with care for others. And I think that's our primary obligation right now. And it also is more focused on how we're doing that and a little less focused on outcomes, which I know is a more traditional, kind of goal orientation for someone in leadership. But right now, the outcomes are very uncertain. So it's good to be focused on the things we can control and contribute to, like our care and the care for others. I also think this is a moment when leaders are really so aware of the fact that even though they're used to thinking of the decisions they make and the work they do for just their sole entity, whether it's a company, a nonprofit, a municipality, we're all connected to one another. And so you really can't make a decision right now in a vacuum. You have to be aware of those connections and the impact that you're having on society and that society is having on you.
And you mentioned the word care, and that moves us a bit squarely and into questions of value and ethics. And I'm wondering, for all of you, as you've gone about either thinking about partial reopenings, thinking about the possibilities of more full reopening, thinking through all these questions about safety and your employees and other matters, have you been guided by, say, 3 to 4 key values as you've gone about doing that? Do you have a mission statement that's been guiding you, a way of thinking about leadership that's been guiding you? I'm wondering if you could fill us in on your process and values as you approach these big questions. And Susan, why don't I start with you this time?
Okay. So I spoke about physical safety and psychological safety, but I would say the framework, the most important framework is respect, and respect for the individual, and trust. And these are not the kind of themes that you build the day that a crisis happens. It's the building over time of the trust and the respect and the communication platforms in the organization. So I never ask anybody to do something I wouldn't do myself. So you may not be able to tell, but I'm sitting in my office today in the factory. I follow all the same practices. I get my temperature taken, and if there was someone here in the room with me, I'd have a mask on. When I leave here, I have a mask on. I really think it's important that, I mean, I'm in a fortunate place where I am able to show up. And although most people don't see me because I don't walk around the factory right now like I would have normally, they're aware that I'm here. I do videos. Videos are shot so they know that I'm here, here on premise. I do have factories in other places that I can't physically be. So I also try to be as present as possible. So it's really respect, trust, listening, communication, and building on the fact that, I think Ann said it, there are the things you can control and the things you can't control. A good job of the things that are in your control so that you have the time and the space to manage the things you can't.
Thank you. And Chuck, I'm wondering how you and Pizza My Heart, in terms of values questions, are approaching these big decisions.
So 5 years ago, we set out, we put a set of 5 core values for the company, and our main number one was create family. So we really started with that is we want our Pizza My Heart family back together, and the entire 350 that are still with us right now are really working together to try to build our business back and start hiring back. And that's a big thing. And we talk about it in our chats almost on a daily time, and how important that is to get our people back and get our family back working. And then it's from the other side, from the customer standpoint, we really want to, we realize, you say, okay, pizza is not essential, but we have so many customers that are coming to us and saying, thank you so much for being open, because you're creating some normalcy for my family. We're tired of cooking, and hearing that really helps us. And then lastly, it's not a bit for profit from us at all at this point. The profit's out the window and everything else. We have this, our last core value is trust and karma. We just trust that we're going to get out of this and we're going to be back to our normal company, and all things are going to be fine. So whatever it takes to get there, whether we have to wait a month or 3 months or take it slow, we are trusting that somehow we're going to get through it, and we're going to have our family back working, and we're back to normal.
Thank you so much. And Ann, if I could go over to you on this. So you mentioned care, Susan emphasized respect, Chuck mentioned family and trust in karma, things will work out. Help us into sort of seeing inside a bit more your own thinking about kind of core values as we face the question of returning, reopening the economy.
Well, I really like what both Susan and Chuck said. I think it's wonderful that they already have in their organizations values that they're actually using every day to make decisions. And when you see that and you know that those are sincere and genuine, then they offer more in times of emergency, because it's much more like the muscle memories there. We know what to do. This is how we do things in our organization. And I hear a sort of a stance of servant leadership from both of them, which I think is really what we need right now, and is very necessary. Here at the university, we focus, of course, on developing men and women for others to create a more just, humane, and sustainable world. And I think right now, justice, treating people fairly, thinking about who's bearing the risks, and doing it in a humane way, caring for one another, those are really important values. And I do see them guiding us in the work we're doing.
Thank you. If I could make a little bit of an inference from that question too, and go back to Chuck and Susan. You could also share with us a little bit about how you've gone about internally at your companies engaging in these conversations with people about what to do. Have you had employee committees, teams, or how has that happened that you've sort of discerned the courses of action you want to take right now? Susan, if I could start with you there, please.
So one of the activities that we took on in Bloom before the shelter in place, not knowing the shelter in place was coming, but realizing that the world that we operate in was changing. As I said, I have a long history of experience working with a lot of companies, and I'm fortunate to have a very experienced leadership team. So when we still sit in a room together, we sat in a room together and came up with scenarios. And we probably had 25 different scenarios. If A happens, B happens, C happens, what do we do? Who manages what? How do we address this issue? So the shelter in place occurred. The first thing we did was get together around that framework. And it was just a spreadsheet, right? Nothing sophisticated. So we were on Zoom, but because we were on Zoom, so we were already working in a new environment, but we had this spreadsheet that we had all put together. And then we were able to, I had one person in charge of the scenario planning. So she put the spreadsheet up on Zoom, and then we went through, all of the different scenarios, added the shelter in place in. So we already had the frame. You don't build these events when the crisis happens. You get prepared as the crisis is occurring. And because we have a global supply chain, we had been managing the global supply chain, months in advance of the shelter in place. But I think if you just step back and look at the experience that I have and the experience that my team has, it's really my goal, no matter what issue it is, business-wise, always be weeks, months, years ahead. And in this case, we had done our planning about a week ahead. It's not way out of my comfort zone. I like to plan way ahead of that. But a week ahead, we had started the framework so that anytime something happened, it wasn't a scramble to figure out what to do with people in different places. It was get on the Zoom call, go back to the spreadsheet, go to the scenario, execute the scenario, and then come back and see what worked and what didn't work. So a lot of the, once you get past kind of the ethics and the values, the things you're talking about are just plain tactics.
Thank you so much, Susan. And Chuck, how has Pizza My Heart gone about discerning together these next steps of action?
So we somewhat got lucky in that we had a full manager meeting a couple days before St. Patrick's Day. And in that meeting, we had talked about, the possibility that our business could drop as much as 20%. So we kind of worked through scenarios with them on what to do if it did drop 20%. Because, in the restaurant business, there's two big things. It's food and it's labor, and you have to keep them in line. So if you drop your revenue 20%, you need to drop your labor 20%. So we kind of all agreed on how that would happen and how we would cut 20% of the hours. And then, 4 days later, our business dropped in half. So that was a little bit of a shock. And because we'd already talked about it, we already had a system in place on how to drop that. And then, the question was, who does this affect? And who do we keep and who do we not keep? And that was a difficult thing. So we kind of gave guidelines to each manager to decide who their key employees were. And it mainly landed with cooks and supervisors that we kept, and drivers, surprisingly enough, and cashiers who mainly furloughed at that point. And the reality of it is, for us, most of the cooks and the supervisors are long-term employees. So they often have families, and from an ethical standpoint, I would, I guess, prefer that they would keep the money coming in, although money is important to everybody. I'm still sad that many of the cashiers, including my daughters, got furloughed out. But we got lucky in that we were set up and that we were able to pivot almost immediately, because that in the end saved a tremendous amount of cash for the company and has kept us going.
Thank you very much. And I invite our audience, please, to keep submitting your questions, and we'd love to bring them into this conversation as we go. Let me also ask here, there's been a long debate in business in the last years over sort of shareholders versus stakeholders, and to whom is a company responsible finally. And with this pandemic, I think this question comes back to us anew, especially because there's, in a sense, very little control we have over how our actions might lead to some chain of causation and infection way down the line. And we also see with the pandemic how communities of color are bearing a disproportionate burden of infection and death. So I'm wondering, does a business in a stakeholder sense have a responsibility to those who are bearing the greatest burden of this disease as it courses through our society? And Anne, let me go over and start with you on that one, and then I'll circle back.
Sure. I think we do have a moral obligation to take care of those people who are suffering the most. And I've really, again, been very encouraged to see American values kind of coalescing around this idea of making sacrifices for the greater good and being concerned about the welfare of others, particularly the most vulnerable and marginalized. So we're seeing real tremendous response to care for the homeless community. And as you mentioned, now we're becoming more aware of how certain minority communities are being more greatly impacted and taking actions that we need to address that. It's also the case that in addition to being a moral, responsibility in a global pandemic, taking care of other people, ends up amounting to enlightened self-interest, because it really does serve the common good. It really does serve all of us.
Thank you very much. And Chuck, could I over to you on that one, please?
So I'm somewhat lucky in that my little bubble kind of fits with that. And when I look at who got laid off, and it was mainly cashiers who often tend to be college or high school students living at home, I don't think they fall into the need like a lot of our cooks who are longtime employees that work a lot of overtime and that have families that are depending on them and are getting hit by this in a much harder fashion, that they're still working for us, and we're still getting them at least full-time hours. So to me, the chips fell correctly for us, and we were somewhat lucky that we were able to do that in our little bubble. But I completely agree with what you're saying on a societal standpoint.
Thank you. And Susan, over to you. This question of sort of stakeholder responsibilities, how far do they extend in this really incredibly difficult situation?
Yes, and you may or may not be familiar. We at Bloom Energy found ourselves in a position starting actually beginning really the day before St. Patrick's Day, but in earnest on St. Patrick's Day, in a place to take what is our mission-driven culture and our deep technical experience of our team, as well as our operational experience, and apply it to refurbishing ventilators. We ended up refurbishing ventilators for states. And when Governor Newsom reached out to the CEOs on the 16th and said, what is it that you can do? Our CEO, K.R. Sridhar, immediately identified that much of the technology that's in ventilators is very similar to technology that we use for our fuel cells. So he called me and asked me on the 16th, do you think we could refurbish ventilators? And absolutely, it's in the art of the possible. We just have to figure out how to do it, which put us on a journey that by Friday of that week, we had ventilators coming from the state of California stockpile, and allowed us then to partnership with to partner with California OES to begin refurbishing ventilators that then went to our Delaware facility and went to states on the East Coast. So it's been a very, very rewarding experience. But to answer the kind of the crux of your question, I believe, and Ann mentioned this, and I grew up in a steel town in Southern Illinois, so I'm very, very passionate about American manufacturing and American ingenuity, is, do what you can do. Not everybody can do. Some people can donate, and some people can repair, and some people can build more. So while our goal was to fill a gap that existed until the equipment manufacturers and the medical device manufacturers could build more, what was it that we could do? And so that's where we filled that gap. And that just happened to be the gap that we were most appropriately aligned with. And everybody, there are more good news, at least my perspective is there are more good news stories out there today when you read about how people are filling the gap, whether it's from people sewing masks at home to companies like Bloom that have deep engineering and operational experience working on refurbishing medical devices.
Thank you. And I'm wondering if we can now, if you don't mind me almost making this question a little more personal. We've talked about opening, not opening, but I'm wondering, or not opening fully, if I could sort of ask Chuck and Susan specifically, should you right now fully reopen your businesses? If so, why? If not, why not? Chuck?
Absolutely not. We're not ready. And we are still dealing day to day with trying to work on this reality. And it's one thing to get your employees to a point where they're safe, to where they're wearing masks, to where they're wearing gloves, to where they're washing their hands consistently and switching the gloves, and that they're washing everything down more than they ever have. That it's a lot for 350 employees to get to that point. That's where we are right now. What we're not succeeding on really well is how do we control our customers? That's the hardest thing. They don't necessarily want to social distance 100%. We've had customers that have just gotten into it with us because, we're asking them not to sit in a booth. We had 2 customers this weekend come in and sit down in a booth and start making out in front of everybody, and had to ask them to leave. And, it's hard on a manager to do that. So to flip a switch and reopen, there's no way. Not, yes, if for some miracle you said, okay, everyone's cured and this is not going to spread, yes, we could reopen, but we still have to rehire, bring these 162 people back in. We're a ways off from this, and whatever happens, I think it's going to be a ramp up. And, we need 2 weeks, we need 4 weeks of learning what the next steps are going to be.
Thank you. Susan.
Yeah, so we're in and I maybe I don't want to use the word fortunate, it's a terrible word at this time, but we're in a more experienced place right now where we have had 7 weeks of working through the how you keep people safe. The next big challenge is going into large buildings with elevators, buildings with shared cafeterias, buildings with shared tenants. So I think to Chuck's point, the phased approach, the ramped approach, we absolutely support that. And once each individual tactic can be managed in a safe way, then you move forward. So that's we're following all of the guidelines from all of the places and working with the building owners and how do you do this well? And once it can be done well and be done safely, then move to the next step.
Thank you. And Ann, did you want to add anything to that question, or sort of, if not?
I like what I'm hearing in terms of engaging people in the decision making and putting people's care first of all, and recognizing that it's going to be a gradual thing, and that the way we prioritize things has shifted a little bit. So we're much more aware of taking care of one another.
Thank you. I'd like to come back then. We've got an audience question about something Chuck referred to regarding layoffs. And I'm wondering if you all could comment. I mean, we're in a situation now where people are being laid off or furloughed or perhaps salary reduction. or all sorts of possibilities. How are you going about making those decisions? Is it in terms largely of seniority, reliability, productivity, someone with a family, someone in need? How are you doing it? I know it's all happening on the fly, but is there better versus worse ways of doing it that you can share with us? And Chuck, since you brought it up, if I could go over to you to sort of share with us your thinking on this really tough question.
It really is a difficult question, and we sat here and battled it out yesterday a little bit in our what we call our A-team meeting. It's time that our business is starting to grow a little bit with takeout and delivery, and we can start hiring back this week a few people. And yes, the choice of who that is, and we're looking at it mainly as who are our best performers, and that's that. We don't want to play favorites. We don't want to do anything else, but we want. It's a difficult time to work in these restaurants, and the people that perform best for us, I think that's who's going to come back first. And in the end, we want to bring everybody back, hopefully.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, so we're in quite a different situation at Bloom. My experience over time, I was in automotive for 25 years, so I was in the unfortunate place of closing factories and laying off shifts and doing this kind of work in my other life. Our key is now is how do we stay very, very tight to again, the essential part of our business. So we are working very hard just to do the work that is essential. And because our, electricity is essential, we're in a less bad situation, I'll say, than the rest of the marketplace.
Thank you. And Anne, any thoughts on how we might best prioritize these matters?
Well, I think a lot of organizations are being very practical right now. So they're finding out who can work, who has the flexibility, but versus who might have others at home that they need to care for, and trying to balance those things out. Again, just sort of that engagement of everybody and talking amongst yourselves and having some confidence that everybody can make good decisions using those values. It's encouraging to hear how well that's working for so many organizations.
I'd like to pick up on that too, a question from our audience, and sort of looking at all of this from the side of your employees and questions of safety. And maybe two parts to this question. The first is, at the federal level, I think the next big federal bill that's being considered, they are considering a liability rule that would exempt business owners from liability for COVID-19 infections for employees or customers. Maybe first, could you give us a sense of what you think of such a liability rule? Is it necessary? Is there a way to shape it that can work for everyone in a good way? And my second question is sort of how to make employees feel safe. So let me hold that in reserve and start with the liability question first. And Susan, maybe if I could invite you to comment on that first, please.
So I don't want to sound trite, but you have to start with running your business with safety at the baseline. I'm not saying liability is bad, but I certainly would never rely on it. And I would never assume that because someone passed a law that gives me or my organization any latitude in doing our job less safe and less secure. So I think that, there are many other, when we're talking about the broad workplace, there's retail, there's things like Chuck has with restaurants, there's small companies, there's large companies. So I guess I don't see it as a negative, but I would not take it as a positive and change anything I'm doing or lower my standards at all.
Very interesting. Thank you. Chuck.
The liability question's scary for us small business owners. it's really easy to blame somebody or a business if you get sick. And did I get sick while I was working? And you do have workers' comp to cover something like that. But if a customer gets sick, and they can put the blame back on the restaurant, then we're taking a lot of liability having people come into our restaurants at that point. And we would need to have insurance to cover that, because that's what you do as a business owner, is you get insurance to cover your liabilities. And with thousands of people getting sick in California, that could be a huge liability, which could then be a huge liability insurance issue for us. So it would be nice to have it covered, and that we don't get into a situation kind of with like the ADA thing with people getting nuisance lawsuits, and that it can be somewhat covered in a reasonable way that we can afford it.
Thank you. And Anne, I'm wondering if you either insight into the liability issue or into this question of how to ensure more that employees feel safe.
Well, of course, I think the way you ensure that employees feel safe is to ask them and to engage them in their own safety and give them the resources they need, whether it's protective equipment or regular testing or those kinds of things. But I also think it's important that we have ways to hold companies accountable for their behavior. We all do, we need some checks and balances to do our best. And we've seen in this pandemic that some of the larger companies have not followed early guidelines, particularly, for example, as it comes to applying for the PPP loans. And so we need to have mechanisms for changing behavior as we go. So this particular question of liability, I think, needs to be addressed at scale. In other words, it needs to be thought about for larger organizations in one way, potentially, and smaller organizations in a different way. And so hopefully we'll have some rational and well-reasoned legislation that comes to support both companies, consumers, and employees at this time, so that people do have that sort of just that fundamental confidence that their safety is paramount.
Thank you. And another just unprecedented aspect of what we're going through is how many parents are now at home with kids, and kids who aren't at school, and the immense childcare complications that this raises in terms of going to work, returning to work, what have you. So I'm wondering here about a general sense of business responsibility for workers in those situations, perhaps especially single parents in those situations. In one sense, should a worker be fired if they won't return to work because they can't find childcare for their kids at home? And or how can a business better manage parents in this time who are facing these immense childcare complexities? Susan, could I start with you again on that one, please?
Sure, thank you. This is a really, really powerful question and a really powerful situation that you bring up, because this clearly, like, as I said, this is not a new problem. This is a problem. The one constant about running manufacturing facilities is you cannot work from home when you're on a production line. So dealing with childcare and workers and balance has been something that I've dealt with. And being a woman and being a single parent, clearly my single parentness is very different than others. But it really is a challenging issue. And what I'm hoping out of this, and I would like to be a part of it, really is to if anything comes out of this contagion that could be positive, is how do we look at some of these very foundational questions about how work gets done, and can we make changes, and can industry partner more strongly with employees to figure out how work gets done. Most people, because of the world that I've been in for the last 30 years, they know if they're coming to work a production job that they have to have childcare. It's not something that's optional. But it's a true, really fundamental issue, and I believe it drives all kinds of other unintended consequences to women in business and women in the workplace. So I didn't answer the question directly, but I do believe that this is now getting the proper focus just by you asking this question, and that we can move forward as a society 2.0 or whatever you want to call it, post this, to really address this foundational issue.
Thank you very much. And Chuck, you spoke so movingly of Pizza My Heart's notion of family, and I'm sure these questions of your employees' families only add to the kind of moral importance of your thinking in this regard. So how do you and Pizza My Heart address these tough questions?
Absolutely. When you posed the question and you said fire somebody because they don't have childcare, I cringed. For us,
I wasn't suggesting it at all.
For us, we need to be really flexible with our employees, and they need more flexibility right now than ever. So we're really focusing on letting people get their hours when they can work, and that's important because we have a number of both parents working for us. So if they're needing to share duties, the mom may be working in the morning, the dad may be working at night in the same restaurant. So it's that's what we can do best, I think, is hear our employees' needs and get them what they need in this case. But that's what you do for your own family. That's what we do. Thank
you very much. And Anne, if I could go over to you on this too, your reflections on this really great challenge of childcare and work.
Well, I'm so encouraged by what I'm hearing. I think this is an opportunity we have as society to really rearrange ourselves around what kids and families need, and put their needs first. And you're hearing that just in the story that Chuck just told. And so we can be doing that more broadly and at a policy level, and in thinking about the ways that we work, how much being co-located matters in some work versus others, and really be aware of getting a school year back and a childcare system back first as a fundamental foundation for being able to say we are ready to pick up our level of activity and move forward.
Speaking of the interconnectedness of it all, in what you say there. One thing we've referred to here, but we haven't kind of grappled with a little more, is anything else that the government, federal or state, could do to help this process. So I'm wondering in particular about the paycheck protection programs, and whether either of you have had experience with those, Chuck or Susan, your assessment of them. And then from the three of you, if you have any sense of what you'd really like to see either the federal or state government doing to assist your business in becoming more fully operational. Chuck, could I go to you on that first, please?
Yeah, so I was very up to speed on the PPP as it was coming out before it was passed. I spoke with a number of local congressmen. Jimmy Panetta out of Monterey has been really helpful. I banked with Wells Fargo since I was 9 years old and have been loyal to them. And they were one of the ones that somewhat stumbled with this. And, I followed it, and it looked like it was the application process would be open on a Saturday morning. I forget what Saturday it was. I stayed up every night, checked it, because knowing at East Coast time, they could open it up. And I applied in the first hour that was available. Wells ran out of money first, and I did not get in because they chose to do all smaller people. And now I'm in round two. I still haven't heard. I get a blank email from them. I mean, not blank, but just the same email from them once a day that says, hey, you're still in line. So it's frustrating because it will make or break my business whether this comes in the end. And that's frustrating. So what could the government do? I would love for the government to say, look, this is not going to run out, and it's going to happen. But to sit there and watch your email each day and know whether it's going to come in or not is really frustrating, because it's incredibly hard to plan a business over the big unknown.
Chuck, if I could ask, when you say make or break your business, could you share with us a little more, like what you concretely mean by the importance of that support?
It is. I mean, the PPP is meant to bring back those employees that I have laid off. So I can't plan whether to bring them back or not. Like, we're sitting here with how do we find out who's still available? I don't want to tell some of these people that are coming back if I don't know that the money's going to be there to bring them back. So that's the unknown. I would love to have these folks back, but without the PPP, that's not possible.
Great, thank you. And Susan, you're either experienced with the Paycheck Protection Program, or your sense of it as someone a long time executive in management and manufacturing.
Yeah, so I don't have direct experience with it because we are in a different situation. What I have had direct experience with over the last 7 weeks is working with the emergency management organizations in California and some East Coast states. So I've had the perspective that I have of what's happening now. I've had very good working relationships as part of the ventilator program. It's allowed to build some really, really healthy partnerships in the states, and I just want to applaud the state workers that I've worked with. They're doing an incredible job, in 6 days a week, 7 days a week, all hours of the day. So a different perspective, but I think Chuck has the much stronger perspective on PPP. Mine is more about working with the people who are trying to keep communities safe and trying to set the standard to reopen the economy. The one thing that I think would be helpful, I'm a pretty pragmatic person, and I work with a lot of pragmatic people, is when the people who are making the decisions talk about this data has to be at this place. And maybe I'm dating myself, but going back to the Ross Perot days, some really simple charts and graphs that say, this is where we are today, this is where we need to be, and this is the line getting there. I think people really just want straight data, yes, no. I've always found in, managing large groups of people that people would rather just know the answer, even if it isn't the answer they want to hear. If they just want to know yes or no. So I think that if I could give any advice to the people who are making decisions, be really clear about yes versus no, and then show the path somehow visually. People are very visual. We're all on Zoom. We're all on social media and watching TV. Put together some simple charts and graphs of what 14 days without an increase looks like. Where are we? So that date is kind of nebulous without doing some tactics and some visuals behind it.
Thank you. And Ian, any sense on your part, either your sense of the PPP program or your sense of what you'd really like to see the government doing to foster the reopening of the economy?
Right. I think we're really at a moment of truth for the banking industry and financial services that's been in the making really since the Great Recession. And we're seeing again here how there's just kind of this unfortunate misalignment between their ability to understand and meet the need in the moment, in this case, small businesses first as a priority. And so government, the federal government needs to potentially get more heavy-handed there. And I think it's an industry that is looking at some more stringent regulation, even though I know that's what most industries work very hard to avoid. I'd love to see some creative innovation, maybe forgiving some school debt in trade for work in some of the high need areas that we're going to have coming out of this, in science, in infrastructure development, some kind of service corps at a time when we know people are really much more comfortable with the idea of serving one another and meeting those needs. And we know we have a generation in the workforce right now that's really comfortable with and seeking to make decisions using their own values.
Well, thank you. And we've just got a few minutes left here, and I'm wondering if we might turn back in a little more of a personal direction. I know from years of working in this area, and we all know from life, ethical values, they can be, they work better if we work on them ourselves in the context of communities, if we take time to really foster them. So I'm wondering, for the three of you, what are each of you doing these challenging days to kind of keep alive the sense of your moral compass as you face these really tough questions? How are you going about doing that? What can you share with us about what's helped you and what's hindered you as you really try to find and specify that ethical voice in the face of these very tough challenges? And Chuck, if I could go to you first, please.
So it was interesting, after my first week of being sheltered in place, I realized I was working so much that I was seeing my kids less than before shelter in place. And my office is at my home, so that disturbed me a little bit. And I kind of said at that point a couple things to the kids. This will be a time that you will never forget. And when you come out of this, you should be able to say something about how it changed you. So think about that, and think about, what did you gain from it? Can you find something to gain? Jokingly, we said the first thing that came out of my 17-year-old daughter's mouth was, "I'm going to get a tan." I pushed them to go a little bit further than that since then. But, I've said to myself, I want to stay healthy through this. We all do, but I want to make sure I take care of myself. I get time away from the business, time to either exercise or spend time by myself, or just doing a jigsaw puzzle to decompress, because it can be all encompassing right now. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on.
Thank you very much, Chuck. And Susan, and we just have a couple minutes left here. So Susan, over to you, please.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm working very hard on being an empathetic parent. So I always tell people it's very hard being my child. I have a high stress job. I travel a lot. And my daughter is a senior, I don't know if I can say it, Notre Dame, but anyway. And so she's not getting a prom, she's not graduating, trying to figure out her college, because I had told her that we would go visit some of the campuses, and the campuses are out of the country. And she kept telling me she was doing great. I'm doing great, Mom. Everything's great. And she's very independent. I mean, like I said, I travel a lot. She takes care of herself. She wasn't doing as great as I thought she was. I went to a parent event, and we on Zoom, and we were all talking, and I'm like, oh, my daughter's great. And all the other parents on the thing said their daughters weren't doing great. So I went home that night and I said, are you really doing okay? And then she kind of told me, no, I'm just I'm trying not to add any more stress to your life. And so, she's really, really struggling, and I was not there to help her through, a rough 6 weeks. I think I'm on week 7. I'm trying to do a better job now, and being more respectful of her, and recognizing that when she says she's okay, she really isn't. So that's what I'm gonna, if I learn anything out of this, of course, she's my last one and she's 17. I guess, maybe I'm learning it too late, but I'm working on being much more empathetic with my own kids.
Thank you very much, Susan. Anne.
Well, there's not much I could add. I'm trying to model what's being asked, to focus on doing the things that keeps my family safe, and really trying to figure out how to let my kids know that, we see the disappointment and the loss, and we understand how much of that they are bearing the brunt of. But as Chuck pointed out, trying to find some silver linings, or some things to think ahead that will, be the good things that come out of this time, including more time with each other, and more time with each other in far less structured ways, that I am finding really refreshing and healthy for all of us.
Well, thank you. And thank you. Our time is regrettably up, but thank you so much, Chuck Hammers, the Big Cheese at Pizza My Heart, the beloved pizza restaurant chain in Northern California, to Susan Brennan, the Chief Operating Officer at Bloom Energy in San Jose, and to Ann Skeet, the Senior Director of Leadership Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. And our topic today has been, when should businesses reopen? And the Ethics Center has developed quite a bit of material in the last week, including a recorded video of this event that we will post on our website for the audience and others to look at. Our website is www.scu.edu/ethics. That's www.scu.edu/ethics. Thank you so much for all of you joining us today. We will have future LinkedIn Live events. Our next will be in several weeks on the pandemic and media disinformation and misinformation. We look forward to having you join us then. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.